This is Making a Scientist, the podcast by young scientists for young scientists, featuring cutting-edge science and all of the life and work advice you'll ever need to succeed. It's brought to life by the brilliant scientists and hosted by me, Alex Ainscoe. Do you want to stay in science but you don't want an academic career? Well, this week my guest is Dr Vicky Sherwood, who is an expert scientific writer in clinical research at Novartis, and she also runs Biomed Badass, a space for early career researchers to gain an understanding of alternative scientific careers and industry. In this episode, Vicky and I discuss the options available to anybody interested in a prospective career in scientific writing and all about her experiences working in industry. We also discuss Vicky's career path, including how she transitioned from an academic PI working in skin cancer into industry, and how the financial crisis of 2008 impacted research funding opportunities, which is a similar climate to which we find ourselves in today. For anybody wondering what a career as a scientific writer involves, you need to listen to this episode. So without any further ado, let's go! Dr Vicky Sherwood, good morning. Thank you very much for appearing on this podcast.
Thank you for having me, Alex.
Yeah, not a problem. So, Vicky's a scientific writer, and I don't really know what that means necessarily. So, what does a career in scientific writing look like? What does the role mean, and what does it actually entail?
Yeah, there's actually, if you enjoy writing as a scientist, there's actually lots of different options for you available outside of research, if that's what you want to focus on. So the term scientific writer is quite an umbrella term. It's quite broad and covers a lot of different career options for scientists. So I guess the first one that people would be probably most familiar with is like a scientific journalist who would write about popular science issues for the media. But within scientific writing, there's other areas you can work in as well. So some people focus on, say, grant writing, for example. Others work as like technical authors, which would be like writing information about manuals really for end users. Others can work in like editing, so you can work in publishing. So a common career that lots of scientists go into is scientific journal editing. And then scientific writer also covers an area of writing within the pharma and biotech industries called medical writing. And medical writing itself can also be split up into different areas. And there are really four real main areas of medical writing. The first is in regulatory affairs, so where you would write documents for approval from authorities such as the FDA or the EMA. There are other writers that work in health economics, so that's about market access for drugs and writing for payers. So healthcare providers who have to make strategic decisions about which drugs they can afford for their populations. And then
I was just going to say, do you need to have like a strong background in like medicine or pharmacokinetics or anything like that in order to do this type of writing?
I mean, it helps. They tend to the pharma industry tends to like to hire people from a life science background. And if if you've got some expertise in, I mean, it can be very broad, but in therapies generally and disease areas, that can help. But equally, I know writers who work in the pharma industry who come from different backgrounds. I know people who've come from physics, ecology. So not necessarily, I guess it just helps, I suspect, to have some kind of background information. Okay. So then the other two areas of medical writing include public relations. So that's kind of, if there's any kind of information that the pharma company needs to mitigate risk against, they would call upon public relations writers. And it's good there to have an understanding of scientific information as well. And the last area is the area I actually work in, which is medical communications. So that's probably quite a large arm of medical writing. And that's where you actually work to write about the clinical research findings for different audiences, including patients and healthcare providers and healthcare professionals as well.
Okay, so does this include, like, if you go to your doctor and then you were to get, a leaflet about your disease or a leaflet about a particular drug? Is this the sort of thing that you're talking about?
Yes, so medical writers can be involved in that kind of patient information writing, but I guess the bulk of it is probably in how the pharma company presents its clinical research findings. So from the clinical trials. So a lot of it is writing, which many scientists will be familiar with, publications. So writing articles, writing abstracts, conference presentations, posters, that type of thing. And then there's another arm which can involve education. So educating internally, like sales teams on the drugs and the risk benefits of those drugs, and also educating healthcare professionals as well. So there's lots of different things that come under that umbrella of medical writing. It is a huge, expansive area. And I guess what tends to happen is medical writers tend to specialise in different areas within that. So you tend to see medical writers who spend a lot of their career in health economics or in regulatory writing. And there is some movement around, so people do move from one area to the other.
This is like, how easy is it to switch? Because I guess when you first are considering a career in scientific writing, perhaps you try one of these different streams, and maybe it isn't quite what you really like, and maybe you think, oh, I'd like to do this other sort of stream. So is there a sort of a period at first where, when you're not as specialized, where it's easy to transition between different types?
I would say it gets easier it gets easier to transition once you've got a bit of expertise in one of them.
Oh, okay.
So I know quite a few people who have worked, say, in medical communications for 5 years or so, and decide that they actually would like to try their hand at something else, and maybe go and try regulatory affairs, and vice versa. So I think it gets easier because you get more experienced in pharma generally, and how pharma processes work, basically. And you get familiar with the compliance issues that you need to take into account when you're doing this type of writing. So it does happen, but if you take your first job, usually you'd be doing that for a few years, I think, to really get some experience under your belt. And then you can think about different options. This is one thing about industry that's quite interesting, which I've found, is that once you're inside and you've got some industry experience, there's lots of different options for you going forward. And you have, I'd say, more so than academia, because there's only really one career path at the minute in academia that's viable. Whereas in industry, you can kind of start to think about different areas that you'd like to try. And after a while, usually most companies, particularly if they're big enough, are open to allowing people to try, often just on like a sabbatical basis, where you could go and try it for a few months. And then if you like it, make the switch over into a different arm or area of the business. So it's quite common. Yeah, it's quite common for writers to do a bit of both. But the reason I said they tend to specialise is they're very different areas of writing, and they require kind of different expertise. And even within medical communications itself, I do see some writers who prefer to focus on publications. Others prefer to focus on, say, education documents. Others might prefer more commercial things to work on. So even within the different disciplines, there's also some specialisation as well.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It's really interesting that you can have that kind of flexibility in terms of, like, you can, go to a different department within the company. That's something that, we'll come on to talking all about academia a little bit later. But this flexibility is, I guess, one of the big draws, right? Like, I guess also that the retention of staff and sort of like your staff happiness would be a lot maybe higher as well in that respect, because you're able to, if people see if they're in a position they don't like, that otherwise they'll just leave. But if you've got the opportunity to be able to try something different, then it's going to be more sort of encouraging to stay. So I guess the next question that I wanted to come on to then was, what is the hierarchy or the progression system like within sort of the scientific writing sphere? I know it's probably different for the different streams, but what's the structure? How does it work?
Yeah, and in general terms, I think it's fairly similar in that you would start usually at an associate level or a junior level, and then depending on how experienced you are when you come into that role. So I think we mentioned at the beginning, if you've already done or worked in different therapeutic areas, your knowledge and understanding will be higher than maybe somebody who hasn't. So people tend to progress through that initial stage at different rates. So say a postdoc who'd been working for 10 years in cancer research, they may only be in a junior writing role for maybe 6 months to a year before they then progress on to what's the next level, which is usually, the terminologies are different between companies, but you would usually start as associate medical writer, and then you would become a full medical writer. And then maybe in another couple of years, you would become a senior writer. And then at that point, there can be two different distinctions within the career path. So either you can become like a subject area expert and become like a senior writer or a scientific director, where you still do the writing, but you maybe have 5 to 10 years experience and more in some cases. Or you can start to move away from the writing and more into the general management of teams. And that would take you a little bit more away, I think, from the actual scientific writing, and take you more towards management and project management and budget management. So there's like a fork you reach where then you usually have to decide if you're going to become if you really enjoy the writing and you really enjoy the work that you're doing, whether you want to stay as a subject matter expert or you want to move away and become more of a generalist. And I think that happens in a lot of industry careers. You reach this point where you have to make a decision if you're going to become the specialist or the generalist. I think medical writing is quite akin to that. And I think all the different arms of medical writing follow a similar pattern, where you would start more as a junior, then work as a medical writer, and then a senior, and then make this decision about generalist or specialist. And getting back to your point that you said earlier was, if you get into a position in medical writing and you decide, I really don't like it, I would recommend to a lot of people, and this is some advice somebody gave me very early on in my career in medical writing, was somebody more senior. And she said to me, if you find that you're in a team or a therapeutic area, or you're doing documents that you really don't like, it's such an expansive career. There's so many different options, as I mentioned at the beginning, of different things you can do. Don't give up on it. Try something else, because it's so big. There usually is a niche for you and what you enjoy, and with your values and your skill set, you will find something and somewhere. And coupled to that, what I've noticed, and I've been a medical writer now for just over 4 years, in that time, it's grown hugely. And it is an industry that's set to grow as well. I mean, it's quite expansive. There just seems to be more and more work all the time, and more companies cropping up.
Yeah, why is there more and more work? Is it because it's gaining more steam? Is it that just more people are interested in it? Like, what? How come?
I think the pharma sector is changing. There are more drugs, there are more chronic illnesses that we need to treat, there are more targeted therapies. And so with all that, there needs to become more detailed communication. I mean, in the past, when they didn't really fully understand the mechanism of action of drugs, you would take drugs and you'd pretty much say, well, they'll cure this or that. Now we have targeted therapies and some very, sophisticated therapies as well, cell therapies, as I said, targeted therapies, biomolecular molecules, antibodies, you name it. There's all sorts of things with huge arrays of mechanisms of actions, and that information about how those drugs work and what value they offer, because some of them are very expensive as well, needs communicating in a very clear way. And as more and more products are coming onto market and there's less and less, I guess, spare cash for healthcare providers to think about different products, it becomes even more important for pharma companies to be able to explain how their drugs, meet the demands, meet the needs of patients, and provide good value for money. So it just seems to be the way the healthcare sector and the pharma sectors have changed, that this emphasis on communications is becoming all the more important.
Okay, and I guess the main driver for all of this is the value for money as well, as well as the communication, right? Because the NHS is not in a great financial position, is it?
Yeah,
So,
and we've got aging populations globally in a lot of countries, and being able to treat their chronic diseases for long periods of time require a lot of money and difficult decisions for payers to make. I mean, who do they benefit over other patient populations? I don't envy these people who have to make these decisions.
No,
but,
me neither.
Those economic decisions do need making.
You do. Okay. No, that's
so
a really
there's lots.
good overview.
The good news
Thank
is,
you.
if you get into the industry, there's lots and lots of opportunities.
Definitely. Well, okay. So, a couple of other questions just in terms of getting started with this. Is that how did you become aware of this position? Was scientific writing something you heard about on the grapevine? Is it something that you we'll go through exactly sort of like your career path, but how did you hear about it in the first place?
I actually heard about it through networking. So I'd come to a point in my career. I was a career academic. I had a lab and research funding in the UK. But I decided that maybe I wanted to try my hand at something more patient-focused. Our research was very basic. And I had worked for 1 year when I'd finished my bachelor's degree in a medical device company. And I think that always sparked my interest in health, in pharmaceuticals and the production of pharmaceutical products for patients. And so I'd always had it niggling around in the back of my head. So I went out and did a little bit of research about what sort of careers there were in the pharma sector. Obviously, I knew about R&D. And, as a researcher from academia, your skill set is well akin to R&D. But I also knew from other colleagues who'd gone into the pharma industry much earlier on, particularly in my PhD cohort, a lot of people had moved over to the pharma sector. I knew they were doing jobs that weren't just R&D. They'd moved into other areas. So I just basically started talking to people. And I also did a lot of, I say a lot, but some introspective work. I sat down and I thought, what is it about being a scientist that I enjoy the most? And writing really came to mind. I loved writing the papers. I actually loved writing my thesis, which a lot of people didn't enjoy.
I was going to say, sounds mental. I'm currently writing my thesis, and I have waves, I suppose. Like some sections, I'm like, oh, this is all right, but yeah, to be honest, it's more negative on balance. I don't particularly enjoy it personally, but yeah, I can imagine a lot of people do. Yeah.
Yeah, I did. I mean, I don't know if a lot of people do, but I did. A lot of my colleagues at the time were like absolutely tearing their hair out. And I wasn't. I mean, I must say, I didn't sit there and say it was wonderful, but it didn't bother me either. I found it kind of, I don't know what the word is, almost cathartic in a way to take all this work and see it, come to fruition in this big document at the end. I kind of enjoyed seeing that happen. So yeah.
Did you enjoy that at the time though, or is it just when you look back at it in hindsight you enjoy it? Do you think?
There were parts I didn't enjoy writing, and then there were other parts I quite enjoyed the creativity of putting it together and packaging it up in a way that I thought made sense. I quite enjoyed that storytelling. Okay. Also, when I was a PI, I really enjoyed going to conferences and talking and presenting the work. In fact, I guess I got more of a kick out of that than actually planning the experiments. I kind of knew that those were my strengths as a scientist, and then I just by talking to people, I actually ended up talking to somebody who worked in medical communications just by chance, really. It was a contact of a contact. And she basically said, oh, this is what I do. I do that for a living. I communicate the science of the clinical research findings. And I was like, oh, wow, that's really interesting. I didn't know that even existed. And it was from that initial conversation that I then went and spoke to more medical writers. I then began to discover that they were specialising in these different areas. Then I had to think about what area I thought that I might be most interested in. And then I had to do a little bit of research about who the employers were. It kind of went from there. But it was all through networking, really. I think I'm a big advocate of networking because that's how I made my transition. But I think you make a lot more progress by talking to people than you do through working at the computer screen, basically. So you hear about a lot of people applying for lots and lots of jobs and not getting anywhere, when actually maybe 4 or 5 conversations might get you more. I think sometimes.
You're always just Googling by yourself and what you're thinking in your own head, and you can get a different perspective or a different spin or just a different way of thinking. That's all it needs. Like, you're absolutely right. It's it's something that's been sort of like taken away, obviously, in the last year and a bit. I know people would maybe do Zoom chats and stuff, but it's not. It's really not the same. I just want. I wanted to ask though, because you've this podcast is all about honesty, and it depends how honest you want to be. But industry sounds wonderful. It sounds really nice. But what are the pitfalls of industry? What are the general sort of advantages and disadvantages of a career in industry? Is it really something like you get your 9-to-5s back? Is it flexible and family friendly? Generally speaking, just because I'm sure there's a lot of people who are prospectively thinking about an industry switch. So it would be great to hear from you what your experience has been, what you think.
Yeah,
without getting you in trouble, of course.
At the end of the day, a job is a job, right? And it is work.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of people out on the internet saying that, go to industry and it's a utopia. It's hard work in industry. It was hard work in academia, but it's just as hard work in industry. But I think in general terms, because industry is just so much bigger and so much more expansive and has so much more wealth associated with it, and academia is a lot more, how do I put this in a nice way? It's struggled in recent years, particularly in the UK and in the States as well. And I think generally it's a bit more limited in its horizons. I mean, there are some folks in academia doing extremely, extremely well and fantastic, but I do think they are the limited few. I think the vast majority of people in academia do find it a struggle. Whereas in industry, because there is just so much more money associated with the whole thing being there, right? It's the commercial sector. I think it's just not as limited for the majority of people. So I think in academia, to do really, really well, you kind of have to sacrifice a lot of free time and a lot of other aspects of your life. I'm saying this in a very general way, but I think you have to be all in a lot of times to make a really good, strong go of it. And that does, that whether people like it or not, it does impact in your life totally. In industry, I don't think you can still do very well without having it to become absolutely all-encompassing. That's what I would say the difference is. So whilst I think you still have to work hard and you have to be technically brilliant, but that's across the board if you want to do well and you want to flourish in a particular career, I think there's just more opportunities. So in industry, so the competition is just not as intense, that you can find your way. And I think it's also because there's a lot more choice, you can play more to your strengths. So you can pick roles that maybe fit with your strengths and values more easily. Whereas, like I said before, in academia, you're on a one-track ladder. and you have to be able to meet each rung on that ladder, otherwise you're not going to get to the next rung. So it's just a lot more closed and I guess one tracked in that way. Whereas I think in industry you've got more flexibility to pick different things that I think could suit your skill set.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because a lot of people say that academia gives you the sort of like the freedom, you have like the sort of, what's it, sort of like, I don't know if this is the right phrase, but the intellectual freedom to do and pursue what you want. You'd be better placed to sort of maybe say, but like, do you find that you actually have a little bit of freedom in industry, or is it more sort of like you get told what to do? Like, how does it work?
Yeah, a freedom is maybe a different thing altogether. It's maybe a different discussion. Flexibility and different opportunities it can provide. Freedom, no. You basically have to do what needs to be done to meet the demand of the company. And whatever that role is, you need to meet that.
Okay.
So yes, there's less freedom.
Okay.
And in academia, this idea of freedom, it's true to an extent, particularly when you get to be a PI, you can ask the scientific questions you're interested in, but within reason. Okay, so, you need to still be able to get the funding. You need to still be able to convince people that what you're doing is right, and you still need to have the results to back it up. So, you while you might like to think it's completely, free thinking area, place to work, actually, I don't necessarily agree with that. I think you kind of have to follow fashions and market interests. And also the commercial sector does play a part in that as well. So if there's a big, strong driver of the commercial sector to enter a particular market, so my experience for example, would be healthcare, and specifically oncology. There's a big drive at the minute to drive immunotherapeutics into the market because they work brilliantly for cancer patients, late stage patients. And so that has an impact again on what kind of research should be done at a very basic level. And that kind of has a knock-on effect on what the funders would like to fund. And so you'll find that then a lot of academics kind of move into that area. So your research is not completely free. It's not without, drivers out with academia directly.
Okay.
But I would say on a day-to-day level for most researchers, there is a lot of freedom in the lab. One day you might decide to do a particular experiment. The next day you might decide to do a bit more reading. In industry, you may not necessarily have those choices up front, right? If there's a deadline at 5 o'clock, you're going to have to meet that deadline that day.
Yeah, that's it.
So on a day-to-day basis, probably not. But certainly in your career progression, there is a lot more option and choice.
Okay, cool. So I don't know if you had any final comments for this section to sort of close out, and then otherwise we can move on.
Oh, Alex, I could go on about this for forever, but let's move on. I'm sure we'll touch on it again.
Yeah. This next section is all about when you were young. So this is sort of trying to understand all about your career path and how you've got to the point where you are right now. So where did you grow up, and where are you from?
I grew up in the UK. I was actually born in Germany, but that was because my dad was in the armed forces, so we moved around.
Okay.
And we lived in different countries. Then we came back to the UK, and I spent most of my very young childhood in Yorkshire. And then my last posting before my father retired was in Norfolk in England. So we moved there, and I spent the last part of my high school years in Norfolk.
Okay.
And then I went off to university and moved around again.
Yeah, where did you go to? What did you study?
I went over to Wales and I started off doing marine biology, believe it or not. I saw
Really?
myself, as a child, I saw myself maybe going off to some hot tropical places and tagging sharks for a living.
That would be so cool. Marine conservationist or something, I know what you mean.
It sounds awesome, but actually
I
think the reality of it is quite difficult, because when I turned up on the course there was like 150 people, And I was thinking, we're not all going to get a job in marine biology. I think we'll be lucky if 2 of us do. So I actually changed my degree within the first 6 months, and I did biology with biochemistry. I just wanted to do something more broad and something that I felt might get me a job.
Yeah, fair enough. So yeah, I totally agree. Like, I think marine conservation is one of those that I'm sure you can spend your holidays going and doing it and stuff. Yeah, but yeah, I can imagine it's very, very competitive to get into.
Yeah, I should imagine.
So you did your degree, your undergraduate in biology. What did you then? What was your next step? Did you go and do a master's? Did you go straight in to do a PhD afterwards?
No, I was one of these who just really didn't think about their career, which was a bit silly, really, in hindsight. And then I came out and I thought, well, I better get a job. And I ended up taking a job at a medical devices company just because they had an opening. And I worked there for a year, and I worked on an inhaled form of insulin. So this company produced inhalers. Their largest client was GlaxoSmithKline, who produced salbutamol for asthma patients. But I was working on developing a new inhaler for inhaled form of insulin, and Pfizer was the client. Unfortunately, that drug got pulled from the market because of contraindications in the lung. So the project actually never went anywhere in the end, although I do know they now have new inhaled forms of insulin as well coming to the market, which presumably, hopefully, will be safer. Because I think the idea of having that for diabetic patients is awesome, right? That they don't have to inject themselves and they could just puff on an inhaler. I thought that was really exciting. But yeah, they need to work on how to get that, I guess, across the lung mucosa safely.
So how long did you work in this job, and then what
actually
did you...
it was only a year, and the reason it was only a year was that I started to realise that everybody, like, in a senior scientist position in that company had a postgraduate education, either a master's or a PhD. So I thought, if I'm going to go anywhere in a company like this as a scientist, I really ought to go and get myself a postgraduate education. So that's what I did. I went off to the University of Nottingham and signed up on a 4-year course and did a PhD in virology in the end.
Oh, very nice, cool. So what was your PhD all about then? What did you, what was your thesis?
It was about DNA tumour viruses. So what year did I start that PhD? I'm just trying to think. I think it was around the turn of the century. So it was around 2000. And that was really off the back of a lot of interest in DNA tumour viruses generally, because they discovered a lot of factors that promote oncogenesis by studying those viruses over the last 2 decades before. So I think a lot of basic understanding about tumour biology came from looking at those viruses. So I worked with a guy who'd come over from the States, and he'd worked on adenoviruses. And adenoviruses are quite amenable to genetic manipulation. They use them now for vectors, for a lot of vaccines and things, and even drug delivery as well. So at the time it was all really exciting, because I was like, we can play around with the genetics of these viruses and change the cells. And I found it fascinating. I also found it fascinating that, some viruses, some of which are small enough with only like 6 genes, can completely reprogram a cell to do what they want. I just found that mind-boggling. And I got completely absorbed in it. And this whole idea of returning to industry, which was my original plan, just kind of disappeared. I ended up sucked into the research interests. And I worked in oncology pretty much ever since.
So after your PhD, you went to then straight to do a postdoc, right? After that,
I did. Yes, I went to the University of Bath, and I wanted to. Working in virology. I'd worked very much with cells, and it was all cell culture work and transformed cells, and I really wanted to work on whole organism biology. Okay. And so I took I took a position at the University of Bath to work on Xenopus laevis, which is the frog model. And it was a developmental model. But the reason that I was interested in that project was they were looking at a novel RAS effector molecule. So RAS is one of the oncogenic driving oncogenic drivers. And so they discovered this new RAS effector molecule doing a screen in the frog. And so they wanted to discover what this protein did, basically. But it was getting to use the whole organism. So, I learned how to work there with tadpoles and development.
Wow.
I learned a lot of developmental biology as well, which was super interesting for me because I'd never had the opportunity to do that before.
I can imagine it's a completely different way of like just doing the cultures as well, actually, because it's not like you stick them in an incubator, right? Did you have a big room full of tanks, or how did it work?
Yeah, you have an aquarium full of frogs.
An aquarium?
And then basically what you do is
Wow.
you inject the females with hormones and they lay eggs. Because all the fertilization is external, you can do the fertilization of the eggs yourself in the water, right, with this vial of male frog sperm. And then you can manipulate them, so you can inject them and change the genetics of them, or whatever you're going to do, so I find it kind of fascinating. And it was also the first time that I was exposed to mouse models as well, because in the group we had mouse model work as well, and so I started to get interested in more mammalian whole organisms as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. So you went straight from PhD into this postdoc. But at this point, like, you didn't consider any sort of like going into industry at all. You just wanted to try try with these different sort of whole organism type models.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. What then did you do after this? So you did this sort of project in Bath then for how long was this? A couple of years or?
2.5 years in the end.
Years.
At that point, I wasn't sure if I would go back to industry after my PhD. I mean, I loved the research, and I thought I'm just going to take a postdoc and make sure the research career is right for me. And it was after my time at Bath that was when I cemented that I was going to stay in academia, because I really loved that research project. It was super interesting.
So what did you do? So after this 2.5 years, it's like, okay, right, I need the next step. I need to take I need to go and do something like cool. Did you then go and work on whole organism models elsewhere, or what was the next stage?
Yeah, so this was an interesting fork in my career, and I don't know if I made the right decision at this point, but I'll tell you about it anyway.
Yeah, please. Thanks.
I really, at that time, so when was that time? That would have been around 2007, 8. Quite a long time ago now. There was really two main areas of interest that were going on that you could, get serious funding for. One really, this is in life sciences or medical research. Yep. One was tumour biology still, so that fit nicely with what I was doing. And the other was stem cells and reprogramming of tissues.
Of course, because when was Yamanaka's? When did he win the Nobel Prize?
Yeah, came out. His paper came out around that time. He won the Nobel Prize subsequently afterwards, like about 3 or 4 years afterwards, or maybe even longer. But he came out, and actually I went to see him talk, and it was like, wow, it was mind-blowing at a conference. So it was I felt like there was two ways I could go. I could go down the stem cell route and also tie that in, because there was a lot of talk about cancer stem cells at the time as well, or just stick down the tumour biology route. And I really tried to decide and toy that up which would be better. And in the end, I decided to stick with the tumour biology. So I went looking for a postdoc. I knew I wanted to go abroad, because I felt like that might be one of my last chances to go and work abroad. I don't know. So I thought, I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna go abroad. And
did you have any idea of where to go, like, or were you just sort of like, I'll go wherever the cool science is?
I did actually mind where I went, as long as there was cool science. But I really would have liked to have gone to the States. So I interviewed for 6 positions in the States. I went over like 1 week, and I flew all over the States and into Canada, and I interviewed for 6 positions.
Wow.
And then I also interviewed in Sweden as well, for a lab that had just spun out a company on something that appeared kind of very exciting at the time, which was a peptide molecule for breast cancer treatment. And it was it was all to do with the Wnt signalling pathway, and I'd got kind of into the Wnt signalling pathway through my developmental biology projects that I'd been working with people in Bath on. So that kind of tied in quite nicely, and I kind of like the idea that they had a spin-out company and a product, and that actually might go somewhere, because that kind of tied in again with my interest in commercial activities that come back from when I was working in industry. But I was also offered a really cool project on cancer stem cells at the MD Anderson from Postdoc who'd just come from Bob Weinberg's lab. The MD Anderson is a big cancer hospital in Houston in Texas. And they do some amazing cancer research work there. So I really was like trying to toy up, should I go to Sweden or should I go to Texas? Texas to me felt like Houston particularly, I didn't feel like would be a very nice city to live in. I might be absolutely wrong on that. In the end, I went to Sweden.
Yeah. Okay.
In the end, I went to Sweden, but actually, in hindsight, I should have gone to Texas. Oh. So that was,
So why do you say that though?
Well, we say we should never have regrets, but if I could retake over, if I could take the time back again, I would have gone to Houston. Why do I say that? I think.
Yeah. Did they go on and win a Nobel Prize or something?
I mean, the lab has done very well, I have to say, and the projects are really interesting that have come out of there. And I think that exposure to that kind of level of high quality science would have been excellent at that stage in my career, would have served me better. Going to Sweden was fantastic. I absolutely loved living in Sweden. It was a brilliant place to live. However, we did have a few...
Where in Sweden were you?
I was at the University of Lund in South Sweden, so I don't know if you've watched The Bridge or any of your listeners have watched The Bridge, but...
I have. I've been to The Bridge. I went actually there when I was interrailing. I went to Malmo.
That's where I was. That's where I worked. I worked at the hospital in Malmo, which was part of the university. It was the University Teaching Hospital of Lund. So yeah.
Okay. Oh, cool.
So I loved living there. I mean, I don't regret it at all. I just... From a career perspective, I think I would have done better in Texas. And I think it's largely because the product that they developed just didn't work. And they spent a lot of time trying to figure out why, even though they'd already spun out the company. I actually worked on an analogous peptide, but in a different therapeutic area that actually did work. So that was quite good. But a lot of the time we were in the lab was trying to figure out why their first molecule didn't work. And so that I ended up losing a lot of time, and a lot of us in the lab did over that issue. It was all in all, it just didn't work out. It just didn't work out as the perfect project that I thought it was going to be.
Yeah. So how long were you in Sweden for then?
Again, I just think shy of 3 years. I think, or maybe it was just about 3 years. Yeah, and then I returned to the UK.
Do you speak any Swedish? But do you speak any Swedish before? No. Yes.
Barn lite. It means only a little, but I mean, right. I actually could start to understand when I left. A conversation in a pub, I actually understood. So I was getting there. I think I probably needed another 6 months to a year to be completely fluent, but I was starting to get there. But since coming back, I mean, nobody speaks Swedish outside of Sweden, right? So there's no chance to practice unless you find a Swedish person.
Well, exactly. So I had a previous guest, Dr. Mick Jones, and he was talking about he went to Denmark to the University of Aarhus, and I asked him if he learnt any Danish, and he said he tried, but everybody kept speaking English to him because his Danish was so terrible. So I imagine it's like that with a lot of the Scandinavian countries. Like you can try, but they'll just they'll be able to. Oh,
this is the
be
problem.
Fluent,
their English is impeccable, and then when they figure out your English or you're a native English speaker, they just want to practice.
Yeah.
But I think Danish is even harder, so he had an even harder job, I think.
Yeah. Okay, so then you moved back to the UK after the Sweden job?
Yeah. I moved to the University of East Anglia in Norwich. And that was to me like moving back to my hometown because it was close. Because I said I grew up I spent Norfolk, the latter years of my high school years in Norfolk. So for me, that was like returning home. It was part of the reason that I wanted to go there as well, to that university. So yeah, I set up a lab there. Unfortunately, it was right on the back of the Great Recession in 2008 and 9. So
Oh,
when the
okay, I
collapse
see.
happened, there wasn't that much funding around. So it was a really difficult environment to try and get funding in.
Mm-hmm.
And I must admit, I found that a struggle. That transition from postdoc to PI is not an easy one. It's very, very challenging.
Did you have
So
a fellowship in between, or did you go try postdoc straight to PI?
no, I went postdoc straight to PI. I think a fellowship would have
Yeah.
been easier. I did get a fellowship afterwards,
Mm-hmm.
but that initial phase of, I don't think the postdoc prepares you complete. Well, it certainly doesn't prepare you completely for a faculty level position. So you go from being a subject matter expert as a postdoc, with good technical expertise, to then suddenly being somebody who those technical expertise aren't as relevant as they have been when you're a postdoc, and suddenly you need to be telling other people how to do these things and managing other folks and getting in money, and existing your life exists on committees and talking about the strategy of things, and it's a completely different set of skills that you need. And teaching, if you've got to teaching part of your position as well, you've got to be good at that.
Yeah.
So it's very different to the postdoc,
Yeah.
very different indeed.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Okay.
I found that one of the most challenging steps of my career to date. Actually, that step from postdoc to PI.
But then around about this time was the financial crash. So
Mm-hmm.
so how did that impact your newly formed lab and getting
Yeah,
the funding?
we struggled. We struggled at Norwich. I can't deny that it was difficult, and I think the scary thing was watching like professors who had money for years and years and years suddenly lose all their funding streams, and it seemed like a lot of people started struggling very quickly. And I think at a smaller university like the one in Norwich, that became more difficult, I think, than maybe some of the larger universities. I mean, I don't know if it's true, but I think wealthier universities could absorb that funding gap more easily.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
yeah, it was a struggle. I also had quite a lot of teaching to do as well. So I was struggling to juggle that along with the research. But it was a good post. I mean, I can't complain. It was a permanent position, and they're few and far to come by. In academia, so it was good from that respect. But in the end, I moved my lab up to Dundee, because we were working on skin cancers, and there was a big cancer research group and skin research group up in Dundee, and I just felt it would be better place for us to get
Okay.
funding and to position ourselves, as experts in a
Yeah.
particular niche up in Dundee. Because I
Okay.
think in the University of East Anglia there's a large focus, because the John Innes Centre is there, and they've got the Institute for Food Research. So there's a lot of focus on like gut health and nutrition
Yeah.
and all this type of thing, which really my research wasn't that focused on. And when I was there, I thought, either I need to tailor my research more towards this type of interest, and I could have done, because I was working on Wnt signaling in the skin. I could have changed and worked on Wnt signaling in colorectal cancer, for
Yeah.
example,
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
which would have been an obvious switch. But then in the end, I decided to move the lab
So did they
and
have
stick with the
like a
program.
unit in Dundee for sort of skin cancer and stuff?
Yeah, they had like a lot of emphasis on dermatology research generally, and they had a lot of skin cancer research through Cancer Research UK funding up there. So they just had a history of working on that, and they had a big discovery on eczema. So there was a big eczema group. They discovered filaggrin as a mutation in eczema.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, there was a lot of interesting dermatology going on. So I just felt it would be a good place for the skin, and I know you're interested in growing like lab on chip type of stuff, but they were doing a lot of
Yeah.
like organoids and growing skin and
Yeah, I love all that sort of stuff. Yeah,
skin grafts onto mice and all sorts of things they were doing. So it was really exciting skin research basically that they were doing.
Okay, cool. So you were how long were you a PI at Dundee, and then if you if you wouldn't mind talking then about the transition that you took to. So you've already mentioned about how like you heard of the opportunity on the grapevine, but how did it all sort of like play out?
Yeah, so I moved the lab up to Dundee, and then my life changed largely because I had a child, a baby.
No.
And the group was growing. Still funding was still challenging. I think that is challenging for most people in academia. So I just had to get used to the fact that I was just going to be writing grants a lot of my life. And I started to think, like, because, I mean, I don't know if all PIs do this, but I felt like I had to work weekends and write grants at weekends as well. And, I was just, I guess, had a little bit of a career crisis in as much as I thought, do I want to be doing this until I'm in my 60s, until retirement? And, when other parents are off at weekends enjoying family life and things like this. So it really started to think about how my career choice had impacted my lifestyle. And it was.
Did you feel like you missed? Did you feel like you were missing out on stuff by working at weekends?
No, because I'd always chosen to do it, and I think doing that. I think a lot of people who make it in academia do that. It's just like a standard. I think. And it was my choice, so I can't say that I felt jealous or I'd regretted it or anything. I'd chosen to do it, but what I would say is my perspectives changed. I had a child, and actually it was interesting. But the senior professor, who was also she was a medical doctor, dermatologist, she said to me, when you have a child, this is when I was pregnant, your perspectives change. And I remember thinking, what's she talking about? My perspectives won't change. I'm so focused on, I'm an academic and, this is going to work. And, I was on my one track, my career ladder. Yeah. But actually she was absolutely right. It did. And, it did make me reevaluate, is this what I want? And I think the thing was, and getting back to the recession, seeing the senior academics in their 60s, who had been very well established, struggling, that for me gave me a vision that, back then I would have 3 more decades of struggling potentially ahead, of me for the rest of my working life. And that really, really, I can honestly say it really frightened me. I felt as if I just didn't have that energy to spend 30 more years doing that. I don't know. It was a really weird time. And sometimes I think maybe was I overreacting? Maybe I should have just seen it through. I don't know. But it opened up a huge area of research for me, which was starting to think about, was there anything else I could do?
Okay. Fair enough. Yeah. I mean, I've personally, obviously, never been through this, so it's really interesting to hear your perspectives and how you felt about it. Also, thank you very much for sharing. I really appreciate.
No, you're fine. Yeah. And I'm sure lots of people go through these career wobbles at various points, and they just stick with it, and then things come out in the end fine. But maybe I'm just too reactive of a person. I don't know. I don't know, but.
Well, to close out this section then, I think this is a really good point to kind of end on is what advice would you then give to a young person, either an undergraduate, a postgraduate or post-PhD or, even any potential sort of like early career researchers, young PIs, what advice would you give to all these different people to sort of like, that you wish you would have heard?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Do you mean in terms of what career path they should take, or just general anything?
Yeah, sorry, I suppose that wasn't really pitched. It was pitched very broadly. Yeah, I mean, sort of, I guess, yeah, just in terms of anything really, like just in terms of different, just what you wish you would have heard, basically. Like I know maybe you're more biased because you might wish about the career path, but yeah, just in general, what do you wish you would have heard from somebody?
Well, I mean, all I can say is that, from my experience and what happened to me, I made that decision to stay in academia. And then quite late on, it took me a long time to figure out that maybe academia probably wasn't right for me. So I think any kind of advice that had helped me get to that point earlier might have made my life a bit easier. Maybe I didn't have to go through all that struggle to then turn around and say, maybe this isn't the right career for me. And I think if somebody had sat me down and really talked to me about, these are your options, Vicky, and you can go for an academic career, but, consider these things. Is it right for you? I think that would have helped. I think a lot of people, particularly if they do well, and they're kind of enjoying the day-to-day, and I really did enjoy the day-to-day of being a research scientist, I think they maybe get a little bit of one-track career advice simply because of the environment they're in academia. That's all you know. A lot of the PIs don't know anything else. They know how they managed to get to be a PI. And so they impart that advice. And I think you don't necessarily get that kind of rounded advice, or certainly I didn't. I think universities are now working towards trying to provide that a little bit more. But even so, a lot of folks inside academia are still only familiar with being in academia. I think a lot of the career advice is still very academic focused in a way, particularly for postgraduates. So it would have helped me to have exposure to some industry professionals and to say, there are these options as well, Vicky. And I think it's difficult to know that academia is right for you if you don't know what else there is either. Because yes, academia might be right for you, but actually there might be something else that's even better, but you just don't know about it. So I think that's important. My advice to anybody at any point, but particularly early PhD students, is really think about this early on, because it takes a lot of effort and research to find out what else there is. But try to decide before your third year, and certainly before you're writing your thesis, whether or not you're going to do a postdoc. Because it gets a lot harder after your postdoc or several postdocs to then rethink your career path. And the postdoc path, if it doesn't work out well, will force you into a corner to rethink anyway at some point. And it's much better to do that earlier on, because you'll be so much further ahead.
Yeah, that's so true.
So that would be my advice. Think about this early, try and get exposure and advice from as many people as you can, and try to get to people outside of academia for advice as well. Don't just rely on academics' advice, because they can only provide one set of advice, right, which is their experience. So
exactly.
Yeah,
that's wonderful. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So for our next section, I'd like to talk all about your experiences in science, which you already have spoken about quite a bit. But you mentioned about your perception of being a parent has changed. How did it change?
I guess it's to do with time. As a new parent, you just want more time with your child, to bond with your child, and it's just a natural thing. And I think it's it can be quite challenging if particularly if you're running a research lab, but also actually if you're a student or working at the lab bench. Your project doesn't just often stop because you've had a child, right? And you hear stories of people having to go in if they have a baby during their PhD. They have to go in with the baby and finish off the experiments because they've got to write the thesis. I've seen that myself. I saw that happen to students. So
what's your experience been of being a working parent in science?
Yeah, I mean, part of my choice of becoming a medical writer as well was, I became a medical writer before the pandemic, and one of the reasons that I was interested by it was that it gives a lot of flexibility, and it gave a lot of flexibility because people work remotely or they could freelance, and I just thought it would potentially give me more ability to work around family life with that kind of career. Also, my husband has a job that involves travelling as well. So it would be helpful for me if I was flexible, yet still able to have, a successful career. So I wanted something that was able to give me more flexibility. So since becoming a medical writer, I have a lot more of that.
Okay.
When I was in academia as a parent, yeah, I must say I did find it challenging. There was a pressure, I guess, to get back into the lab as quickly as possible, to not take too much time off, because that's time away from publishing. And I think that is very challenging, and I think it has traditionally been quite a hindrance for women particularly. More so than men, because men just haven't taken as much time off with their children, although that is set to change as well going forward. So, I just think for working parents generally, it can be a struggle, to juggle everything. But I guess that's across the board in most careers. But that was part of my my criteria for looking for a new career. I wanted something that would provide a little bit more flexibility.
Fair enough. Okay. What has been your most memorable experience in science?
Gosh, that's a good one. I can probably count on one hand how many eureka moments I had in research. So they were very few and far between, but
Okay.
those moments where it's like, wow, and it really does work, and those used to give me goosebumps, and I do miss those to an extent, but like I said, they were few and far between, but I guess that's what most researchers live for, right? That moment of, oh wow, this is working, and yeah, I don't know if you've had many of those, Alex. Yeah.
I've maybe like one or two, but not. I mean, nothing sort of like mind blowing yet. I'm still waiting on mine. Like my mega one. I think it'll come along at some point. But yeah, okay. So you'd say just getting these eureka moments. That's sort of the thing that sticks out the most for you.
Yeah, I think I had I'll pull out the first one. It was during my
Please.
PhD, and I had a struggle as a PhD student. I started off, like I said, I was like on a 4-year course, and I started off with a master's, and we were working on noroviruses, and they're impossible to grow in culture. Noroviruses, they can grow on cruise ships, right, and in old people's homes, but you cannot grow them in cell culture, and so we were struggling. We just basically got a plasmid and started working with the individual genes. And we started to try and see how the genes interact with the interferon system, which is like the natural defense system of the cells against. It's like an innate immune system to get rid of viruses. And this project just didn't work. I mean, we tried everything. I mean, it completely crashed and burned. So after a year in, I decided to start working on adenoviruses, because at least I knew they could grow. And my supervisor was like, well, look, why don't you try and tie it in with noroviruses and work on gastrointestinal adenoviruses? Because that way, at least then you've worked on one gastrointestinal virus, you work on another. It's like, oh, that's a great idea, I'll do that. And then these gastrointestinal adenoviruses didn't grow very well in culture either. And it was like, oh no, I'm gone from one, frying pan and fire. These viruses are a nightmare. And around that time, there was a paper had come out from the University of St Andrews from a virology group who had manipulated the interferon system inside the cell by adding in another viral gene from a different virus and completely blocked it. And so I went up to St Andrews and I used their vectors and I generated a new cell line. And I remember taking it back to Nottingham and putting these viruses on it, these enteric adenoviruses, and the growth was like 100-fold higher. And I was like,
Wow.
oh, wow, they grow.
That's awesome. That's
It's
awesome.
changed my whole project. And it did. I mean, then it was like the second year of my PhD, and I really didn't have that many results. So from then on, in that last year and a half, I managed to gather all the data. But that was a real, I remember having goosebumps looking down the microscope, because we had fluorescent tagged virus, and just seeing all this green fluorescence was like, it's
woo.
worked.
Yeah, that
It was
must have
worth
felt
it.
euphoric. Yeah,
It was.
Okay.
It was. Yeah.
So, We've spoken about sort of the difficult decisions you've made during your career, but what has been the highlight of your career?
Um, I can honestly say the highlight was helping junior researchers develop when I was an academic. I really enjoyed that as a PI. In fact, I would say I even enjoyed that a little bit more than the research itself. But seeing them like come through and really, come through a struggle and then really nail it in the Viva, for me, for a PhD student, particularly if they'd started off and it had been tough and the project and they'd seen it through, that for me gave me a huge buzz. That was a huge high point for my career.
Oh, nice.
And so,
Okay.
yeah, in my medical writing career, I'd like to get back to that. I'd like to get back to kind of management and helping people develop themselves. So that's where I'd like to see my future go. But we'll see. We'll see. Hopefully
Okay.
we'll get there.
Yeah, fingers crossed. I'm sure it will. I'm sure it will. You'll find a way to merge it somehow. I have every
Yeah,
confidence.
I think I just enjoy people management, I guess.
Yeah.
Not everybody does, but I really do. I'm a people person, so maybe that wasn't the best career choice for me either as a scientist. I don't know, but I like working with people. I like working in teams. So yeah.
So what's been the best piece of advice that somebody ever gave to you?
Yeah, there's been lots and lots, I think. I think when I was starting to think about my career change, somebody mentioned to me that think about careers that are in high abundance. Think about or industries that are really, really abundant and are going places, and try to avoid industries that are in decline or, a little bit, I guess, like this was from somebody who had been in academia, who had left. They weren't working in medical writing, they were working in a different sector, but he really said to me, think about where, if you're going to change career, you want to be somewhere where there's going to be lots of jobs and it's really an employees market rather than an employer's market, because you're coming from somewhere that's an employer's market, which was academia. And it is an employer's market because there's just such a huge excess of PhDs. And I think that was really sound advice, because there are industries that, are very highly competitive again. And I just, for the reasons that I'd mentioned before, I was just tired of that. I didn't want to be working every weekend. I had a young family and I just wanted, I'm not lazy or anything, but I just wanted something that would give me lots of opportunities without having to give all of myself to it as well.
I don't think anyone's like thinking that you're lazy listening to this podcast.
It came across as a bit lazy, didn't it?
No, not at all. Not at all. It's just some people don't want to do like 60, 70 hours a week and sacrificing all of their free time, especially when they've got a young family. Like, I mean, yeah.
Well, I think my problem was
like,
that I had been there and I had done it for so long.
Yeah.
I was tired of it and I wanted something else. So that piece of advice for me was, something that really resonated with me and stuck with me. So when I was doing this research and figuring out what there was to do, I wanted an industry that was growing. And I think I said at the beginning, medical communications is expanding and will continue to do so, I suspect, for the next decade or two.
So did you feel like you had to have the experience of struggling, like, so within in academia, obviously, like you knew what was expected of you, but if someone would have said, oh well, when you have kids, then what you actually need is like more free time, it's something that but even like knowing that, or even if someone would have told you, do you think that you had to have gone through the actual struggle and experienced it for yourself in order to really realise that it wasn't for you? Do you see what I mean? I don't know if
I do, and I think yes, probably yes, right, I think you do. I think I did. Sometimes I wonder if I'm not that good at forward thinking and forward planning. I think some people have a much better intuition of how things are going to pan out for themselves, but for me I'm always very in the moment, and I think I'm quite optimistic in as much as I always think things are going to work out, and 9 times out of 10 they do work out,
Yeah.
And, you know, I have been very lucky and I've been very fortunate along the way with lots of things. But then I think, again, and this might come back to this thing that I mentioned earlier, if you're doing well at something, I think it's difficult to evaluate. I think, you know, a lot of people are like struggling in their PhD or their postdoc, and they hate that moment. But those moments give you an ability to reflect and think about these sorts of things. Is this right for me? Do I want this? I think because I kind of, aside from my PhD, which was a struggle until that point I said the experiment worked in my second year, I kind of had quite a good time of it. I had a bit of a struggle in Sweden with that project where we, you know, the product didn't work, the other product that they built the company on. But aside from those 2 points, everything else kind of, it went okay. I can't say I had a massive, horrendous time in academia or any time that really caused me to sit down and reflect if it was right. And maybe if I had have had that, maybe I would have thought about these things earlier, and I would have thought, am I going to want to do this until I'm 60? Am I going to want to keep going? And early on, I think I would have said, yes, I love the research enough that until I'm 60 odd, I will be happy being in the lab 7 days a week.
Mm-hmm.
But actually,
yeah,
I think you've got to think about how, you know, your life changes, right? From when you're in your early 20s through to when you're in your 60s. And throughout that time, you know, different things happen to you, and you need to reflect and evaluate.
Yeah, you're constantly evolving, aren't you?
Yeah, and I think that's more and more important these days, because people don't seem to stay in one career track. They do tend to move around a lot more than they ever used to before. You know, you hear about people that have moved, you know, between 3 or 4 careers during their working life, sometimes even more. So, you know, I think that ability to sit down and reflect, and I think it comes from a lot of introspective work, which I think as scientists we think is a bit fluffy and sometimes we don't want to do. But I think it's good, it's time well spent. And I didn't really do it until that moment in Dundee when I started to think about other things. I'd never done it up until that point. I'd never sat down and thought, what are my values? What are my skill sets? What do I enjoy doing? What makes me tick? What activities do I get lost in? I'd never sat and thought about any of those things. And when you do that and you align your working life to that, life becomes a lot easier.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I think that's solid advice. So yeah, thank you very, very much for all of it. I really appreciate that. On to your final thoughts then. What would your advice be to young people right now who have been struggling with the pandemic and with the sort of all of the struggles that have come that are associated with that?
Yeah. It's been a torrid time, hasn't it? I've struggled myself as well. I had another baby during the pandemic, and you know, having a baby as well is quite
congratulations. Sorry, I didn't.
Well, thank you. It's quite an isolating experience anyway. But during a pandemic, when you're cut off from loved ones, it's very isolating. So, I can only imagine how hard it is for young folks, you know, who are used to going out. So my nephew, for example, he's at university at the minute, and he spent the first year of his university life pretty much in a room doing online lectures. And that's not the experience I had at university. And my heart goes out to people. You know, it's no fun, is it? It really isn't. And the university experience should be a lot more rounded than that.
Yeah, it really should. Yeah.
But you know, I think we're coming out of it now, right? Hopefully. And I think a lot of things will change, and maybe for the good as well. Maybe some good will come out of this terrible, tragic situation. In as much as maybe we'll see more flexible working, more remote working, less needing to travel into big cities, which, you know, does impact on your quality of life. And I think that's a great thing. And I think it was coming anyway, slowly. Like I said, the industry I work in, Medcoms, it was doing that anyway. But I think this has forced it into other areas and other industries. And maybe some employers who were very reluctant to it and said, you know, it's not going to work if you don't have water cooler chat and people aren't in the office and we can't see what they're doing. But it has worked. Larger part of it has worked, and industry has kept going, and so from that respect, I think some good may come of it, and so that might give more opportunities to people going forwards who want more flexibility and want a better work-life balance. So that's a positive.
So I guess. Yeah, but I guess like for young people, I suppose it's sort of like stick with it. More opportunities are going to come your way in future.
Yeah. So for example, in medical writing, when I started out, I was told that I had to go into the city, and I was closest to London at the time. Have to go into the city to learn how to be a medical writer. So I had to go in every single day and sit with a more senior writer and learn from them. Now the industry is remotely onboarding people. And so what that means is that, you could be in the Outer Hebrides and want to be a medical writer, and you will have that opportunity without having to go and live in London or in Manchester, for example. Yeah. And so, I think opportunities like that, and that's just my industry, but there must be examples in lots of other industries as well.
Yeah, I'm sure there are.
Gives young folks, who have the relevant training, it does give them more flexibility and options, I think, going forward. So that's a great thing.
Yeah, definitely. And you mentioned about this sort of like the water cooler chat thing. Chatting over a coffee at the coffee machine, whatever it may be. It's one of those that I think. So I've been going back into the lab more and more, and it's been getting more and more populated. And I certainly think that a hybrid way of working is going to be better in future. Like I noticed that I can't sit and concentrate at my desk and read papers, whereas if I'm at home, I'll pop the kettle on quite happily, have a cup of tea, and then I'll sit down and read without any distractions. I'm that sort of person who I really need to get into the zone. But yeah, like, I think there's definitely positives and negatives to come out of it all. But yeah, hopefully focusing on the positives and thinking about all of the opportunities. That's that. I suppose I'm a pessimistic person as well. So to hear me being optimistic is very rare. Anyone who knows me will will know this. So yeah, but you have to try and think positively for sure. I wonder then, how do you see the future of scientific writing or scientific writers?
Yeah, this is a good one. This is a really good one because I'm a little bit apprehensive at the minute. I think we will see a growth and continue to see a growth for the next 10, maybe longer years. And then I think artificial intelligence will take over a large amount of writing. It's already coming.
What do you mean? Yeah.
So say, for example, regulatory writing. That takes a standardized document in the pharma industry called a CSR, which is basically the document you get out after the clinical trial is complete. And it's usually written in a very prescriptive way. So once you're familiar with these types of documents, you can go in and find the information you need, and most medical writers do that. But of course, what that means is that a computer program can easily do that as well, right? It can take the data that you need on drug efficacy and drug safety, and it can write a regulatory document. Or it could write a scientific paper. So I think there will be an impact of artificial intelligence on the industry. I for sure I know that. And I know that because there are huge economic drivers. It's expensive to employ lots of writers. And pharma is having to employ lots more writers because of the issues we said about communications and more drugs and more hoops to get through to get things into market. So it's driving a need for something that can replace that manpower, right? So basic documents that can be at least pre-populated or filled by artificial intelligence may then only require a senior writer to go ahead and review, those documents. And I can see there will be a real push towards that. Now, whether or not that means there will be less writers going forward, I don't know, because there is an awful lot of writing that cannot be done by a machine at present, because there's a lot of creative writing that I do, particularly with certain projects, that are not as prescriptive as here's the CSR and take all the data you need out of it. There are things like, how to present something in a way that's easily digestible by different audiences, and thinking about those different audiences, and what do you say to patients that then you wouldn't say to an HCP, a healthcare professional, and vice versa. So,
Okay.
I think that sort of stuff, maybe as the technology improves, but we're nowhere near that yet. So I think there will be a degree of artificial intelligence coming into the industry that will prescriptively be able to write very, very basic documents that could then be reviewed by a writer. But then it will require still a lot of writers to work on the kind of more creative communication side of things. And I think we're many decades away from an artificial intelligence program that can do that type of work yet. I'm not saying never, but yet.
But it will. Oh, that's really interesting. So this next question sort of ties into that, but I suppose that is the AI is probably a bit further off in the future. So at present, in science in general, which emerging trend do you see as having the greatest potential?
In science, in general?
Yeah, just in general, yeah. Like,
what are we talking about? Populating Mars?
Well, if you think that's got, this is the thing, like, quite possibly, like, it's just, so a lot of people, it's really interesting to hear some answers for this question, because some people, you can tell that, like, some biologists just give pure biology answers, the chemists or the bioengineers kind of give, like, chemistry answers, but then some people say like completely sort of different things. So yeah, what do you think?
I mean, it's really difficult for me to comment on things outside my field. So I'm going to stick with home, right, and talk about oncology. I work in oncology as a writer, and there's been a lot of buzz around immunotherapies and what that can do. But I really genuinely believe once we understand which patients are responding and which ones aren't and why, and the molecular understanding of that, I think we will have a cure for cancer. And I don't think we're that far away, actually.
Wow.
I mean, some of the cancers haven't responded that well, so there's a lot more work to do with that. But some of the cancers, I think within 10 to 15 years, we will have a cure for late stage tumours. And I think dying of cancer will be a thing of the past eventually. And I think that will be driven by immuno-oncology.
So which therapies is it? Like, which therapies are you referring to in particular? Is this the CRISPR, or is this CAR T, or like what are you?
Yeah, so CAR T it definitely has huge scope. Specifically, I'm talking about the immune checkpoint inhibitors. I mean, some of those trials originally for melanoma were unbelievable. I mean, melanoma was a disease where if you've got metastases, you literally it's very aggressive and it spreads very fast. You're talking about a maximum a year, but we're talking about months. And when the original immune checkpoint inhibitors came to market and they were testing them, or not on market, sorry, but in clinical trials, I remember I just started working as a medical writer, and some of that early work had come off for melanoma, and just to see the early work had been published in melanoma before, but some of the early work in lung cancer we were working on, just to see that data on the Kaplan-Meier, which is like the survival curves of patients. I mean, the treatment arm actually flatlined. I mean, it was actually like nobody dropped off. And I mean, these were people with, late stage tumours. They had brain metastases. And there they were, like 5 years out, and they still hadn't died. We sat there and I said, this looks like a cure. There was goosebumps all over my arms. It's fabulous, to think that, that those people were probably told they had months to live.
Yeah, it's no longer.
And there
they
were on a trial,
and
they were living. Their tumor had gone, right? So, I mean, that is amazing. Unfortunately, not everybody responds in that way, and so trying to pair out why that is and what we can change, at the molecular level to try and improve that is going to be, is something that the pharma companies are heavily working on now, and a lot of academics. So I think we will get there. and there's absolutely tons of money being ploughed into it, so I'm optimistic, but I do think we're getting close. I don't think we're that many decades away, really, from, dying of some cancers being a thing of the past, which will be fantastic.
Definitely. I can't wait to... I really hope that comes true. Like, I really do. That'd be...
So do I.
Okay, so very final question. I asked this to all of my guests. If you could do it all over again, what would you keep the same, or what would you change?
I think I've touched on that a few times, haven't I?
Yeah, exactly. But
what would I do the same?
Yeah.
I would take that postdoc in Texas, in the MD Anderson. Definitely, I would have gone to the States. Okay. I don't know if I'd have returned to the UK, in all honesty. I'd have to have seen how it had gone, but maybe I might have had a career in the US. Simply because I think, we had a huge period of austerity in the UK, and, entering back into that back in the day, I found very tough. So maybe I'd have chosen... I mean, things were tough in the States as well, but I guess they've just generally got more money.
Yeah, it seems so, yeah.
There may have just been more opportunities. I don't know. Who can say, what would have happened? But that would have definitely been one thing. I'd have gone to the US to do the postdoc, the MD Anderson. And aside from that, I don't know. Sometimes people ask me, did you make the right decision leaving academia? Should you have stayed? I don't know. Sometimes I do think there are aspects that I miss. But other times I think, no, what I'm doing is the right thing. It's the right thing for me and my family, and, I enjoy it, and I feel like I've got more opportunities going forward. So I don't think I would have changed that. I think I'd have still left. But whether or not I'd have left earlier is another question. I don't know.
Okay.
I may have done. If I'd been given the advice that I said I needed earlier on.
Yeah, exactly.
I may have left after those postdocs, I think, rather than gone for a PI position.
But like we said, you said rather, like, maybe you needed that experience of it to know. So it's it's why this question's always interesting, because there's never a right or a wrong answer, and you're very successful as you are now. So it's really like refreshing to hear all this honesty from you and all of the different career paths. So I'd like to just thank you very much again for your time, and for all of the comments and everything that you've said. So thank you, Vicky.
You're welcome. I hope your listeners find it helpful. They're trying to plan their careers.
I'm sure they will.
I guess I should say that if anybody's interested in medical writing as a career, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or look at my webpage, because actually I write a lot about medical writing, medical communications, and working in the pharma industry there. So there's lots to read about that industry and transitions into that industry on my website, which is www.biomedbadass.com. That's www.biomedbadass.com. So do feel free to check that out and sign up actually for the newsletter, because I tend to send a lot out to the folks that have signed up rather than directly posting sometimes or publishing actually on the site. So if you're interested in medical writing, do check that out.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Bye.
Thank you very, very much, Vicky. I'm incredibly grateful that you found the time to talk with me about this, and I'm incredibly appreciative as well of all of the honesty about the choices that you had to make, because I can only imagine how tough it was leaving academia as a PI when you'd already begun to set down your roots. I'm absolutely sure that somebody listening to this podcast will be getting in touch with you soon, and they're going to discuss transitioning to scientific writing. So again, thank you very, very much. Please do make sure that you keep subscribing and following us on Twitter and YouTube. It's really, really important because it helps us out a great deal. And please rate me on your podcast platform as well. Episodes are now coming thick and fast. So next week, Wednesday the 2nd of June, I'm going to be joined by Dr. David Miller, who's a resident hack fellow at the Imperial College Advanced Hackspace, where we will talk all about what it means to be a professional hacker. Until then.